And welcome to this panel about developing restorative justice diversion programs. We have two speakers today, Jenna Kress and Sandra Rodriguez, both of whom are here from Impact Justice, a nonprofit organization based in California, with the mission to disrupt the harmful effects of our current criminal and justice system and to provide alternative solutions towards safe communities and justice for everybody. Without further ado, I pass now the floor to Jenna Kress.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on where you are calling in from in the world. We are going to be introducing pre-charge restorative justice diversion to you all today and talking a little bit more about what that looks like. And we will introduce ourselves. And I'll pass it over to you, Sandra.
Thanks, Jenna. Hello, everybody. My name is Sandra Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a senior program specialist on the Restorative Justice Project team at Impact Justice. We do have our larger office in Oakland, California, but where I'm based from, and then half of our team is also in our Washington, D.C. office. And I have been with Impact Justice for 5 years, but I've been working in a variety of different ways in restorative justice for a little bit over a decade. And I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm so pleased to be joining you all for the next hour or so. And I'll pass it back over to Jenna.
And I am Jenna Kress. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I also work based out of our Oakland office. And I have been on the team for about 1.5 years now, the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice. And before that was facilitating this restorative justice diversion model that we'll be talking a little bit more about today. And we'd love to get to know you all a little bit. So if you can put in the chat your name, your pronoun, what your role is, or what section or division you are within a department or an organization or things like that, where you're calling in from. And Sandra's going to put in a link into the chat for you to look up who the native caretakers are of the land that you are calling in from, if that's something you can look into or have looked into potentially. And what is your why? In one sentence, what motivates you to do the work that you're doing? So we're going to take a few minutes to let those responses come in so that we can have a better understanding of who's here with us today. George Mason University, awesome. Thanks for
great,
sharing, Mike.
Thank you. Yes, and we're going to talk about, the systemic change and transformation that really needs to happen in order for restorative justice to thrive. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
There are a few more of they're out there. We know you're there. So we invite you to share in the chat and introduce yourself or share whatever you're wanting to share with us. If not, we'll get started in about a minute. Okay.
Welcome, Elizabeth.
We have Darren, who's a detective sergeant in Palm Beach, Florida. And Darren says, I enjoy it, exclamation point. That's a good why. John from the UK. Thanks everyone for sharing. And feel free to continue sharing in the chat. And we're going to keep going. So these are the learning objectives that we're hoping to work through with you all today, to really be grounded in principles of restorative justice, what that means. Hi, Clara, welcome. We're happy to have you here. We are hoping to support you all in having an understanding of this specific restorative justice diversion model in relation to the criminal legal system, and understand progress in launching restorative justice diversion programs. So we are going to get started with the roots, and I will pass it over to Sandra.
Thanks, Jenna. And yeah, we're going to spend just a very brief moment discussing the roots of restorative justice, which are, very, very deep and far-reaching across the world. And one slide will not do justice to the roots of RJ, but of course, in the interest of time, we wanted to start off by saying that restorative justice is rooted in Mennonite and indigenous practices from across the world. And these practices are utilized by First Nations people of Canada, Indigenous Americans here on this land, the Maori people of Aotearoa, otherwise known as New Zealand, tribes in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, like I said, all over the world. That goes without saying that restorative justice isn't anything new or unique. It's really a framework that has been present in practically every culture around the world for centuries. And this larger worldview ties justice to healing and restoring balance to oneself, one's relationships, and to nature, which we'll go a little bit into through the course of this presentation. But the biggest takeaway here is that RJ is nothing new. A lot of restorative justice has more to do with unlearning and remembering than it does with acquiring new information and new skills. And this is really about tapping into who it is as people and remembering our own humanity. And I will, I believe, pass it over to Jenna.
Nope, this one's you too.
Lies. Okay. So a little bit about, the model that what we'll be discussing is based on, which is called family group conferencing. And that is, again, from Aotearoa or New Zealand. And it's, we'll refer to it sometimes as FGC. So the restorative community conferencing process, which we will sometimes call RCC, is mainly used in existing restorative justice diversion programs here in the US. And like I said, it comes from the FGC model in Aotearoa. Aotearoa is the Maori word, like I said, for New Zealand, and the Maori people are the indigenous people of Aotearoa. In 1988, New Zealand's government commissioned a report identifying government practices that resulted in a disproportionate number of Maori youth being incarcerated. The government took feedback from folks and began using a Maori-inspired restorative process called family group conferencing to address youth wrongdoing. And in 1989, the Children, Young Persons, and Their Family Act made family group conferencing the primary way of dealing with harms that were caused by children. Now, implementing FGC was intended to both reduce incarceration, which it did do, and reduce racial and ethnic disparities. With racial and ethnic disparities, you'll sometimes hear us refer to those as RED throughout this presentation. But what they learned after decades of implementation is that RED persists unless RED reduction is intentionally focused on in the beginning and revisited throughout, all while collecting and checking the data the entire time that a program exists. So it's really not about setting out to do something, but it is about setting out to do it, checking whether or not you're doing it throughout the course and the lifespan of a program and a policy, and of course adjusting when you see a need to adjust in order to continuously address RED. And for more information and background on this topic, you can look at the New Zealand's Youth Justice Transformation Lessons for the United States report written by the National Juvenile Justice Network. And we will get these links to you either in the chat or as a follow-up.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you.
So it's really important, and we always start with kind of the teachers in this and where this came from. Like Sandra is saying, it's not something new, but what it is at its core about relationships. It's about how we create relationships, maintain relationships, and mend relationships when they are fractured in some kind of way. And it's based on a philosophy that we're all deeply interconnected with one another, and that we live in relationship to one another, whether we want to or not, and our actions are going to impact one another. So, grounded in this idea of interconnectedness, restorative justice is really able to provide an alternative way to addressing wrongdoing or harm when it happens. Harm is seen as a damage to a relationship. And Howard Zehr, who is a professor at Eastern Mennonite University, wrote some of the first texts or academic texts, I guess, on restorative justice, said, and I'm going to read aloud what he said. We are in direct relationship with the people we harm. Sometimes we know the person we harmed, sometimes we don't, and the relationship begins at the moment of harm. In recognizing that, we're really called to a paradigm shift in how we look at and frame justice as a concern for healing or repairing harm directly to the person who is harmed as much as possible. So we look at crime as a violation of relationships, and those violations create obligations. People have needs that come up when they are violated in their relationships. And the central obligation through restorative justice is, as much as possible, to do right by those that were harmed to the best of everyone's ability. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about some language and questions that are asked by our current system, and how it's kind of approaching wrongdoing, and the shift in terms of the questions that are being asked in restorative justice. So our criminal legal approach primarily asks what law was broken, who broke that law, and how should they be punished for breaking that law. And a restorative approach really shifts the focus into who was harmed. So who has been harmed? What do they need? And whose obligations is it to meet those needs? And some additional questions we can ask are, who has been directly or indirectly impacted by the harm? So yes, there is potentially one person who is most directly impacted by harm, but we don't live in silos, right? Harm ripples out and affects all of us in different ways in community. What are the root causes that led to this happening? And what is the appropriate process? What is the appropriate process to move forward? So I'm going to pass over to Sandra, who's going to walk through the language that we use so that we're all on the same page and grounded in an understanding of the language.
Thanks, Jenna. Yeah, and another thing that we'll talk a lot about today is the notion of a paradigm shift that Jenna just brought up, and that includes changing so much of what we do and how we do it. And that includes language. So this slide here is titled The Language of Change, because you'll notice again throughout the presentation and in a lot of restorative justice literature, programs, so on and so forth, that the language that's used is different than, again, what's commonly used in the criminal legal system. So you might have noticed that even so far that we've oscillated between using terms like person harmed or survivor, responsible party, etc. And we avoid language like perpetrator or offender. It's really important for us to stay away from the victim perpetrator binary, because we feel that these labels fix people in time and don't allow for a fluidity of identities. And as you know better than most, many of the people who cause harm may have also been survivors of harm themselves. And that's something that's also really important to remember throughout RJ. We also similarly reject binary thinking in how coordinators or RJ facilitators are trained to guide the restorative justice process. So rather than trying to remain neutral, which is really not possible, or partial, which can lead sometimes to bias, RJ facilitators are trained to care equally and be equally invested in the outcomes of all participants, regardless of their role. And this is what we call equal partiality. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, Jenna, please.
So this is a broad picture of what an RCC or restorative community conferencing process could look like, the different phases that exist. So once a case is sent over to a community-based organization from a referring agency, which is typically a district attorney's office, the staff or facilitators will meet with those that are involved to see if and how they want to be a part of this kind of process, and if they're able and willing to be in this kind of process, which is a very involved, often intensive process. And the facilitator, once those who are invited to participate agree that they want to participate and how they want to participate, the facilitator then prepares every single person, including that could be the responsible party, the person who caused harm, the person who was directly harmed, both of their support people, community members who might have a stake in what happened or have been impacted by what happened or connected to those people. And so the facilitator works to prepare every single person to participate how they want to, and ultimately to come together if they want to for what we call a restorative community conference. A restorative community conference is a dialogue that's facilitated by the facilitator, for lack of better words. And the first part of that conversation is really about the harm and impact. People taking responsibility for that harm, people sharing how they experienced that harm, talking about the needs that came up for them as a result of that harm, asking any questions that they might have for anybody in the space. And then after that main dialogue is had, everyone works together in that space to create a consensus-based plan. So what does this person who caused harm, this person who is responsible for the harm, need to do in order to make things right to the best of their ability, in order to meet the needs of the people that were in the space? And what is the support that they need in order to follow through on that plan? So that plan is created by everyone. We call it a restorative plan in the conference. And then the last phase of these programs is that person working towards achieving that plan and following through to the best of their ability to meet those needs, the needs directly of those that were most impacted by what happened. And then once that plan is completed, in the majority of the programs that we work within, that is kind of the final piece of the program in which no charges are filed against the responsible person. So they have addressed the harm and been accountable to that harm through a different process, through a relational accountability process that often also supports the healing of people moving through it as well. So Sandra, I will pass it to you.
Yeah, so this next slide here is really just an infographic of what Jenna just described. And, you know, it might be hard for you all to see on the screen. There are higher resolution versions of this infographic on our website and in our toolkit that we'll discuss a little bit down the line. But I think that one of the more important takeaways here is that restorative justice diversion ideally will happen soon after a harm takes place and before a young person or a responsible person is further embedded into the system by way of things like a court process, you know, sentencing, conviction, so on and so forth. So we'll go more into detail on what that referral point looks like, but really this is just to demonstrate visually what the RCC process can entail and how it would differ from a traditional court process, as well as where the various points of referral can be. So it could happen soon after arrest. It could happen by way of a probation department or a district attorney's office. We can go to the next slide, Jenna, please.
So this is just a quick snapshot of some of the communities that we are working alongside who are developing these programs. So with the Restorative Justice Project, we are supporting communities in developing these programs for themselves based off of their needs and their strengths. And so want to give a glimpse, at least in terms of the US counties that are doing this work, because that's what we're familiar with. We're not as familiar with all of the different efforts that are happening across the globe, but there are a ton of different efforts that are happening across the globe in terms of restorative justice. Sandra, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk a little bit about the harms RJ is good for.
All right. So here's a list, and it's short and brief and general. There are of course more harms, but these are some of the more notable and more common harms that RJ is good at addressing, and that a lot of the RJ diversion programs we work with receive. So burglaries, assault, vehicle theft, robberies, etc. It's worth mentioning here that RJ has also been used for homicide cases with surviving family members as the harmed party. So what this list gets at really is that RJ is best used for serious cases that have an actual identifiable survivor or crime survivor, because we want the person who caused the harm to be able to connect what they did to the various impacts their actions had on the survivor. Also, these types of harms have survivors who really need to heal, and studies consistently show that restorative processes can reduce post-traumatic stress symptoms for survivors, such as anxiety and fear. Survivors so often need to know, why me? Because otherwise they come up with their own self-blaming answers. Folks might think to themselves, if I hadn't parked my car there, if I had just stayed home from the party, if I wasn't walking so late at night, so on and so forth. So having the person who harmed them answer questions about why they did it can help reduce some of this self-blame, and reducing this self-blame can reduce their post-traumatic stress syndromes. And lastly, on this slide, it's worth emphasizing that this is, as Jenna mentioned already, an intense process. And when the intensity of an intervention is disproportionate to the harm, it can actually lead to an increase in recidivism. So really what we're looking for is that a deeply impactful experience can be tied to a deeply impactful healing and accountability process. And that's why harms are best suited for restorative justice when they're more serious in nature. We can go on to the next slide, please. So for the next part of the presentation, we're going to take a closer look at each of these 8 elements of our restorative justice diversion model. I'll go ahead and read them aloud here, but like I said, we'll spend a little bit of time on each of them. So they are oriented around people harmed. Programs should address racial and ethnic disparities. They should be pre-charge, meaning that the point at which a case is referred ideally is before charges have been filed against someone. They prevent net widening. We'll talk a little bit more about that. They'll be strength-based, rooted in relationships. They'll protect confidentiality. And lastly, they will be held by community. We can go to the next slide.
So this first element is being oriented around the needs of people harmed. And we talked about this. And it is possible that in the traditional criminal prosecution process, a state's interests can often be in direct conflict with those of survivors. So this process is different in that way. It is specifically oriented around what survivors want and need, and identifying ways that they can heal, or that I don't want to say that they can heal, that they can be supported in moving through healing, whatever that looks like for them. Healing isn't really healed isn't an end destination oftentimes in reality. And it can be about getting needs met, reclaiming power, and kind of realizing a vision for what moving forward needs to look like. And I'm sorry, I'm in a city and there are alarms and sirens happening behind me if you hear those. And of course, all of this is done with the support of RJ facilitators and with support people involved in this process. And so it is really important to note that this is our first element because it really is the priority of our facilitators and RJD facilitators across the country and people who are doing this work to lead through that way. I'm going to go on to the next one, which Sandra mentioned briefly before and is going to go into more detail about now.
Yeah, so element 2, addressing red and ending BIPOC criminalization. So that means that programs should always be structured to address racial and ethnic disparities in order to end the criminalization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And that's another term that you may see in different parts of our presentation, BIPOC. So, diversion programs often fail to reach the communities most impacted by our harmful criminal legal system. Therefore, keeping red at the forefront of how we implement RJ diversion programs is truly essential. To address red in incarceration, the jurisdictions we operate in create referral criteria by asking which offenses are people of color disproportionately arrested or incarcerated for, and where are people of color being disproportionately contacted by the system. We then go and essentially bake these case types and zip codes or geographical regions into the referral criteria. So this, as well as removing restrictions for prior criminal history and ensuring that participation is always at no cost to participants, allows us to interrupt the cyclical nature of disparities, where if you're from a certain community, you're more likely to be surveilled. Once surveilled, more likely to be stopped. Once stopped, more likely to be arrested. Once arrested, more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, more likely to be sentenced heavily, so on and so forth. What's, again, really important to remember is that this is a powerful tide we're disrupting. So we have to apply all the power that we can in order to do so. And we can go to the next slide, Jenna.
Thanks, Sandra. So another element is that this is a pre-charge diversion. Another thing, sorry, something popped up. I need to update my computer. Another language that we use sometimes is a front-end diversion. So as early as possible, like Sandra was saying. And the intention of that is to minimize the interactions with the system for both the responsible party and the person who is harmed. And that's because research does show that whenever possible, it is helpful to avoid or limit contacts with the system. And that even contacts, however brief, can have some negative psychosocial and employment effects, and often can not address some of the underlying root causes of some of this behavior. So that is why our programs are developed to be as early as possible, pre-charge, and that's why once a program is completed, no charges are ever filed against that person. And we'll go on to the next. Sandra?
Sure. So element 4 is preventing net widening. So these programs should definitely be structured to do that. And net widening is a term that's commonly used to describe essentially involving folks in, in really programs, processes, systems, anything that they don't necessarily need to be involved in. And so that is something that is sometimes referred to also on the programmatic side as over programming, but tied to, the seriousness of the impact of the harm, for example, is net widening. Is this something that a person really, ought to be referred to? Is there a way to prevent, to fully stop further system impact, aside from this, so on and so forth? So what we see from studies is that restorative justice is most effective at addressing more serious crimes than less serious crimes, as we've mentioned, and violent crimes with identifiable survivors rather than property crimes. Appropriate cases for these programs are therefore felonies and high-level misdemeanors with identifiable crime survivors that would have resulted in incarceration or probation for the person that caused the harm. This helps RJD participants meaningfully connect to the emotional, physical, and psychological impacts on a survivor while simultaneously curtailing our epidemic of mass incarceration. So again, is this the appropriate process for the situation, for the impacts, for those involved? And if not, what is a different process? Because RJ is not, it's not a one size fits all. Certainly, it's not something that should or needs to be applied to every single harm. And so keeping this for serious harms is a way of preventing net widening. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, Jenna.
Thanks, Sandra. So this next element is all about having a strengths-based approach to healing harm. We believe that it is not only possible, but it is critical to walking alongside someone in accountability in a way that really reinforces their strengths and their assets. And we want to shift the narrative of what is wrong with someone to what is right with someone, to focus on what you already like about yourself, what you're good at, what you're curious about, what you want in your life, what you want life to look like for the people around you, what you want your community to look like, and really work through kind of cultivating that power for change. And so it really is important to have a strengths-based approach when working with anybody. And I don't have the quote written down, but Brian Stevenson often says, we are more than the worst things that we've ever done. And we are more than the worst things that have ever happened to us. And so that is really the main intention behind using a strengths-based approach, is to give space for a whole human and all of their humanity to exist in spaces. Sandra.
Thanks, Jenna. So element 6 is rooted in relationships, and I feel like we can't say this enough. Relationships are at the root and the core of restorative justice. One of our former colleagues would always say, what are the 3 R's of restorative justice? And a lot of folks would come up with a lot of R words, and she would always respond, relationship, relationship, relationship. So again, we can't say this enough. Building, mending, and maintaining relationships is truly the core, the root, the heart of how we conceive of justice, and therefore how we design these programs. And apparently, trusting, loving relationships add 15 years on average to one's life. So even now, the studies are showing that it's all about relationships. And something else that I really want to highlight on this slide is that this not only includes relationships between participants and their support folks, their loved ones, their caregivers, their families, but also the relationships between facilitators and participants need to be built on the foundation and the principles of RJ so that trust can be deepened. So this goes in all directions and for all those involved, including folks that facilitate processes. We can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Thanks. So protecting confidentiality. Nothing said during the process can be used against someone in a court process. Also, nothing said during the process will be taken outside of the process by facilitators or by other participants. And that's really important in order to support people and invite people into truth telling. One of our coworkers says, we live in a society that is often allergic to telling the truth. And this process really invites you to bring your open, honest self in, and really requires you to do that. And in order for you to feel secure in doing that, confidentiality needs to be upheld. And so this is something that happens with participants, with facilitators, but this is also something that happens before a program is even launched, when a memorandum of understanding is developed between a community-based organization and a system partner, typically a district attorney's office who's referring the cases. Confidentiality is incorporated into that and agreed upon by all participants before a program is even launched.
Okay, so element 8, created and held by community-based organizations. So you see here on the side that RJ processes must function outside the criminal legal system because the power to heal resides in the community. So being held by community means that just that RJ processes function best and are in alignment with the values and goals of restorative justice when they're able to operate as fully as possible outside of the legal system. Communities have a better understanding of conflict and needs and should be resourced with this tool to address those conflicts. This also takes into consideration the legitimate distrust of the system and system actors by marginalized communities, and allows those communities to reclaim their power to heal in accordance with their own values and principles. And I know that a couple of the questions in the Q&A ask about community and community-based or community-held RJ. So we'll take an even deeper dive into that during the Q&A session. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Jenna.
Yeah, we want to make sure we have time to go into that. So in talking about RJ working, I'm gonna move through these things a little bit quickly so we have time to get to the questions. But RJ works. We know that restorative justice significantly reduces recidivism for people who are moving through the process compared to people who are moving through the traditional system for similar kinds of cases and similar populations. And we also know it is much more affordable than moving someone through a traditional process through the system. And it is also rated highly satisfactory. That's not a good word. Survivors and persons harmed who move through the process are incredibly satisfied with the process. And I think that really probably does have to do with it being oriented around their needs and wants. And so 91% of the people who have participated in this process as a person harmed for this one program in Alameda County, when they did this report, would participate in another conference, and 91% of people would recommend this process to a friend or someone that they know. I'm going to run through these also briefly, and 75%, and this is on a program that was working specifically with youth. 75% of those young people who completed the program indicated that the process was good or had a good or big positive impact on their relationships with their families. 84% of the young people who completed the program noticed a good, big, or positive change in their ability to deal with conflict. 75% said that it improved their communication skills, and 82% of the young people who completed the program said they have used restorative practices such as repairing the harm and truth-telling in their personal lives since participating in RCC. And I think that's a really important one. Is this is not just a program. This is not just something to do when harm happens. It's really about how we exist in relationships, the skills we use. We are human beings, and if anything else, we are guaranteed to harm one another because we are flawed. And I know I have hurt many people in my life. I know I have been hurt by many people in my life. And so knowing how we can respond in our relationships when that hurt happens is really important. And it's about living into that paradigm shift that Sandra was kind of talking about earlier. Sandra.
Yes, and really quickly, I put a link in the chat to the California Policy Labs report that some of the stats that Jenna just mentioned, they came from there. So feel free to click on that. And it's a really detailed report that is based on the Make It Right program in San Francisco, which is one of the longest running programs within our cohort of RJD programs. And so for this slide, we wanted to put these two questions up mainly for all of you in the audience to take a little bit of time right now during our presentation to think about them. Feel free to put your responses in the chat. Feel free to jot them down so that you can journal or just think about them later. And even jot them down and bring them back to your colleagues, to your organizations, to your communities as possible, discussion points to start the conversation on restorative justice and what it could look like and what it could mean in your own community. So the questions to consider for those of you that aren't able to see our slides are, what about RJD or what about RJ diversion is in line with your hopes and dreams for your community? And what are some steps you can take to move toward these hopes and dreams? So again, take some time to just think about that. I'm going to check our chat. Let's see. Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Mike wrote, RJD is a way to form closer and more meaningful community bonds. Yes, that is so very true. And the way that I like to look at, that interconnectedness that exists in communities and in many communities might not exist or might not be as strong as it could be. That foundational community bond and interconnectedness is really the foundation and the tapestry upon which restorative justice is based, but also where it's going to thrive. The stronger that those interconnections in communities are, the stronger that RJ processes and programs can be. And then Mike, you also wrote, understanding that the individual is not a separate entity, but is affected by and affects the rest of the community. Absolutely. We are so very much tied to one another, even when we don't feel it, when we don't realize it, when we don't know it. And RJ is a way to feel it, to realize it, to know it very, very deeply in a very, very transformative manner. Thank you for that, Mike. And I think we can go to our next slide. But again, please think about these as you go on with the rest of your day. Thanks, Jenna.
And continue to put them in the chat if you want to, if you're feeling called to keep sharing.
Yes, absolutely. So this slide, as we approach the end of our PowerPoint presentation, is, it's titled, "What can you do to support restorative justice diversion?" And like I hope we've emphasized throughout all of this presentation is that this really does take a whole community. It takes a village. And here are just a few ways of supporting RJD. You can share wisdom on supporting survivor healing, advocate for restorative justice diversion, and assist in raising awareness about RJ diversion. You can, look into, develop, support networks of survivor serving organizations that support survivor healing. And we do want to highlight our restorative justice diversion toolkit. The link is there on the slide, and we'll put it in the chat as well. That's a little bit of a typo. With those anywhere interested in starting RJD programs in their communities. So that's really a toolkit that will walk folks through what it means to talk about RJ in their community, to consider it, to conceptualize it, to form relationships and connections with their local system partners, and to really start that process of bringing or of supporting and creating a restorative justice diversion program in their city, in their county, in their region. And it even goes as far as, including a boilerplate memorandum of understanding, which is essentially a written agreement between system partners that would be referring cases to an RJD program and the community-based organization that would hold those processes. So it's a really, really good resource and tool that we recommend everybody check out. And I think we're ready for questions. I see that we've got some activity in the chat. So
Yeah, I definitely want to lift up what John said really quickly. I think it was in response to the prompt. I think really to start changing the ways in which we think about criminal justice and the idea of justice in general, moving towards a more humane and actually efficient method to promote safe communities and reduce the mass incarceration epidemic. One might say incarceration might just breed more crime and more incarceration. Yeah, and violence begets violence. And we are often defaulting to responding to violence with more violence right now. And our communities are not safer because of that. We know that our communities are not safer right now because of that. And so thank you so much, John, for uplifting that. And yeah, think about for yourself another question. What is your definition of justice? What does justice mean? Not what are you taught seeking justice is, or what we're conditioned to know as justice. But when you think about the word justice, what comes up for you? What are your hopes and dreams around that? So yeah, thank you for bringing that in. And Daniel, looks like you're here.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Sandra. This was a very interesting presentation. One of our questions, which is also something I was wondering about, in one of the earlier slides, you showed a map talking about working with communities in those areas. And so this question, when you say communities, who specifically are you working with to push these programs? Are you working directly with police departments or who? I'm very interested to know how you accomplish this.
that is a great question. I can get us started. Jenna, please, as always, jump in at any time. But yeah, so this map that's on the screen right here is really a map of the different counties that are currently implementing or working on developing and implementing restorative justice diversion programs. And so these are all counties that we have relationships with. And in each of them, there is at least one community-based organization that's holding the program. And then they have a relationship with their respective system partners. So that could be police departments, district attorneys' offices, departments of probation. Some programs are even in relationship with public defenders' offices. But the nature of that relationship is really based on referrals. So as we mentioned, this is a diversion program, meaning that someone has come into contact with police based on the possibility of having done a wrongdoing. And so if they meet the criteria and the case meets the criteria for referral, then that system partner would send a case over to a community-based organization. As far as how we develop the relationships with these different communities, that's been done in a number of different ways. Our organization and our projects has been approached specifically by community-based organizations that come to us and say, hey, we would really like to start a restorative justice diversion program, and we would love your support with that. We've been approached by system partners that say, we would like to support restorative justice. We would like to see cases go through RJ processes rather than stay with us and go through a court process. How do we do that? We've even been approached by folks that are not affiliated with an organization, and they just say, you know, I live in such and such town and such city, and I want people in my community, my neighbors, my children, my loved ones to have access to RJ myself. How would I do that? And so a lot of how to kind of get this off of the ground, like I mentioned, is contained in the RJD toolkit that Jenna put the link in for in the chat. But what we mean when we say communities, for the most part, is folks that are not affiliated with system agencies such as probation departments, district attorneys' offices, police departments. We consider them the folks that should be holding the programs, implementing the processes, facilitating the processes. Whereas our system partners, obviously we use the word partner because we really, really mean it. The RJ diversion programs work in partnership with these agencies, because that's where the cases will be diverted from. That's where we have an opportunity to build internal championship for restorative justice and more system-based support for restorative justice. Some programs are funded by county dollars. That's another really important part of the conversation that we're not having here today, obviously. And we're talking about a paradigm shift, which includes shifting not just what's happening in our community, but what is happening in our systems and in agencies. So really it takes everybody, and the processes themselves should always be held in communities because they are, fully outside of the criminal legal system. I hope that helped, but Jenna, please jump in or ask other questions.
Thank you. A follow-up question to that. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges you've encountered when working with communities?
Great question. Jenna, I talked a lot. You want to start us off?
Start us off. And please jump in. I think, John, actually what you put in the chat might be one of our biggest challenges is what do we mean by justice? And really this paradigm shift of supporting people in understanding a different way of being, right? We don't, and again, I know there's people in different cultures who are on this, so I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone, but I know in the communities that I'm a part of, I wasn't in a culture that really supported deep accountability. Often accountability is attached to shame and punishment and being told that you are bad and wrong and needing to be isolated or thrown away. And that does not invite someone into wanting to do right and do better by the people around them. And so really shifting into this paradigm of building, sustaining, mending relationships, and doing that alongside one another, and doing that with truth and openness and care and empathy. Those are not necessarily things that we are like taught. We are often taught, whether it be through direct messages or subliminal messages, that is something that is scary and bad or is risky for you to do. And so that can be one of the biggest challenges, is just supporting people and understanding this paradigm shift. When we've so often been conditioned to live in a way that is antithetical to those values. And so really supporting people in building a strong foundation for these programs and this work to happen in. You can't just like plop it in somewhere. Sandra always talks about building fertile ground for things. And this is something that needs to be planted and root itself in fertile ground. And that is culture shifting work. And culture shifting work is really hard work. So that, I think, can be some of the biggest challenges. And there's a lot of fear for people, for everyone involved, right? There's fear for this, the fear that the systems have in sending cases, even though they know that it might be a better like fit for a case to be addressed in that way. There's still fear. There's fear for people to participate in something that's so different from what they know. So yeah, those are some of the things that come up. I mean, then there's funding, but everyone has challenges with funding. Sandra, I'll pass to you.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Jenna. I mean, I can only really echo that and add just a little, a little bit more as far as some of the challenges that I've experienced. And, one of the biggest challenges I think across the board that I've seen is the realization of how limited resources and services are for folks outside of an RJ diversion program. One of the workshops that we've just begun to work on and offer is called the ecosystem of healing. And what it's based on is this notion that a restorative justice program is a way of bringing people together to address harm and to discuss accountability and healing and come up with a plan to make it right. And there is the rest of people's lived experiences, their lives, their realities, the impacts that they're experiencing that are either directly or indirectly or just not associated with the harm that happened. And all of those needs, all of those impacts ideally should be addressed in order for folks to have a holistic experience of healing and accountability. So what does it mean to not just build restorative justice diversion programs in a given city, county, or area, but also programs that support housing needs, mental health needs, general health needs, job assistance needs, and so that ecosystem of healing, I think, is at the, is really the considerations for it are at the forefront of what it looks like to develop an ecosystem of healing, but also so essential to the success of RJ diversion programs. And connecting that for folks can be challenging. To say RJ is not enough and it is, an incredible process is a difficult conversation to have, but one that's really important to have and to have early on as you bring, more and more support for RJ to your community.
Here's one more question, and it might well be related to these other previous questions. What prospects do you think there are in the US to expand these programs across the country? And what might be some of the limitations, both in terms of implementing these programs and their effectiveness?
Great question. Jenna, should I start us off? I mean, I think that there are a lot of prospects. I feel like there are a lot of limitations, and there's a lot of need for more support and, funding, for example. And creativity is also at the key of growing restorative justice and expanding it. And that means thinking outside the box. So the RJ diversion programs that we're talking about today, they're often associated with things like criminal justice reform, for example, alternatives to incarceration. You'll hear us use terms like that. And there is a conversation to be had around how is RJ a good fit for public health, for example, for just the development of health and human services in general, for social services. RJ in education is a whole other realm of restorative justice that is separate but deeply tied to something like RJ diversion. So I would say that there are more prospects and there are more opportunities to support RJ than one would think, if we see how RJ is deeply, deeply tied to a variety of different aspects of just existing and living amongst each other. I'll pass it to you, Jen. I'm going to look at the question again, because I think there's more to it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you naming that, Sandra, because one thing we didn't necessarily highlight and uplift, I think, as much as we could have, is that this is not just one program. RJ really can be used in so many different ways, like Sandra was saying, in a school setting. It can be used in a preschool. It can be used in a family to resolve and work through conflict. It can be used in a peace and reconciliation commission process, right? Like, it can be used from a really, really intimate micro experience to a huge, huge experience. So I think it is a practice. It's not a program. And so thinking about different ways to incorporate this practice into community is really, I think, the foundation needed to expand these kinds of programs. And I think the reality is a lot of people want these kinds of opportunities and they don't know that they exist. People want alternatives. There are a lot of persons harmed who don't want to go through a traditional court proceeding for a number of different reasons. And they don't even know that there's any other option available to them to have any sort of accountability process. And so I think giving space for people to learn about restorative practices understand that there are more options available to them if they want that. And then to ask for those things, because if people aren't asking, and a district attorney's office doesn't even know that a community might want something like this, they're less likely to build that out. But if they know, hey, we want this, we elected you, and this is something that we want, and we need you to support this in order for it to happen, then that's huge. So that's one thing. I mean, there's also legislation can be a barrier. There are legislative barriers to certain kinds of cases that are legally allowed to be sent through a diversion process in some communities. Sandra, any other thoughts? There's a lot. And it's different in each community, really. That's the point, is really understanding what the barriers are in your own community.
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit to, some of the limitations and or barriers, in addition to what Jenna mentioned. One of those is, what we're seeing, especially I would say in the last 5 years or so, which is so different from what we saw 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, we saw a lot of reluctance on behalf of system partners to support something like restorative justice. Now we're seeing a lot more interest and a lot more interest in supporting, but not just supporting RJ that's community held, but also exploring what it would look like to have in-house restorative justice. So what would an RJ program look like that's housed within a police department or a district attorney's office? And like we said, we don't believe that that's where RJ should live. And so I would say that one of the challenges, and sometimes one of the limitations, is seeing, like we said, RJ that's accessible to as many people as possible for very serious harms. So having those, again, paradigm shifting conversations with system partners is so important. And to that end, I think that there's also sometimes a push to, for lack of a better term, professionalize restorative justice, asking programs, well, what type of educational backgrounds or certifications or licenses do your facilitators have? When in reality, it's not a strong, elaborate educational background that is going to lead to very strong facilitation. It's first and foremost lived experience. So it should be people that have experience with being survivors of harm themselves and having caused harm themselves that are going to make wonderful facilitators, especially if they have ties to the communities that they're in, that they'll be working with. This is why facilitators that are BIPOC, facilitators that are formerly incarcerated are so important. Other limitations are language barriers. We need to have more facilitators that speak a variety of different languages. This is a process that can be difficult when you utilize an interpreter, for example, especially one that's not familiar with, that slide back in the early part of our presentation, those shifts in language. So those are a few different limitations, but I don't see a limitation. I really see an opportunity to explore and expand restorative justice in each of those categories. And, one thing that I like to say before I leave every presentation is that ultimately RJ is not about humanizing systems. It's about desystematizing humans. So whatever that might mean to you, take that and like those two questions we asked folks to consider what it would look like to desystematize ourselves and each other by being in community with one another. And what could a program built around that notion look like?
Desystematizing humans. I like that very much. That is going to have me thinking for a while. There seem to be no more questions. So we're going to go ahead and close this session. Thank you very much, Jenna. Thank you very much, Sandra. This was very informative. I have to say, personally, I did not know much about this topic, but there's a lot of food for thought here. And I definitely want to continue reading about what it is that you do and what it is that restorative justice is and how it works. I think, considering you mentioned that nowadays there's been more interest from police departments, I think that's a very positive sign that, we all understand that our current system is failing us in many ways, and we need to think about different ways to handle things. And so, like you say, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and that's great. So thank you very much. Speaking of lived experience, our next session in this room is about lived experience. Thank you again, Jenna. Thank you again, Sandra. And thank you to our audience. We hope to see you in our next session. Bye.
So
Thank you
much.
so much, Daniel. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Good day.